Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and this is the Political Postbox, where I look at some of the more engaged with comments from the past week and add my own thoughts to them. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, on to the first one. Unelected bureaucrats. We have our own. We call them civil servants or sometimes officials, but they're unelected bureaucrats, which of course are very important. And there was a bit of a comment here. This was actually a reply to someone else, and you know, this was based on my video on who's in charge of Brexit now. The fact that there is no minister in charge of Brexit. Some person answering here, it's a simple answer to the thread titled David Frost. Now, before I go through the rest of the comment, David Frost is a civil servant, an unelected bureaucrat. He's not a minister, and therefore he's not the minister in charge. So that's not the answer to the thread title at all, because he's not in charge. He's in charge potentially of the civil servants, of coordinating efforts towards the Brexit negotiations, but he can't actually be in charge of policy because ministers decide policy, you know, the elected buffoons. But anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment when I've gone through the rest of the comment. It says, he is now recruited from a range of Whitehall departments. Again, that's crucial. Whitehall is the civil service. So he's recruiting civil servants, yes. That's not ministerial. Including the soon-to-be defunct, it is now defunct. It was defunct, at which the point this comment came up. Department for Exit in the EU, DEX-EU as it's sometimes called. Brexit department, frankly, is much easier. To create a new unit that assesses policy trade-offs, including between sovereignty and economic costs. Mr. Frost's colleagues expect the EU to try and run down the clock and to push Britain to attach strings to any deal, including access to EU fisheries, but they say Mr. Frost will push back hard. So here's the thing. Let's look at the comment first before we... I'll go through who this guy is first of all, David Frost. Because you may have heard of David Frost, it's not that one. This one's a civil servant. So, as I've said, he's a civil servant, an unelected bureaucrat. He's very pro-Brexit. He is actually pro-Brexit and therefore a good pick to be in charge from the civil service point of view, the Brexit negotiations. There's no then accusations of him trying to impede the process because he's fully on board with it. Boris Johnson's very happy with him. Number 10 in general is very happy with him. And his appointment is very much appreciated by Brussels as well. It's important to point that out. It has to be said that Brussels were not enamoured of the politicians, the ministers we used to keep sending, because they know nothing about anything. That's ultimately the problem. But I'll come on to the issues of democracy and technocracy later on. But yeah, Brussels are very happy to have this guy in charge. Very on the ball, very clever. Now, this issue here about him saying Mr. Frost's colleagues, first of all by saying that you're talking about a report that's third hand. You know, someone said that someone said that someone said this. So, you know, when you say Mr. Frost's colleagues expect the EU, that's not the same as Mr. Frost himself. But let's say some people expect the EU to try and run down the clock. Straight away, that is completely untrue because the clock is only there because of Boris Johnson. You know, so the EU, there's nothing about running down the clock from their point of view. They think the clock should be set at like 10 years. They'd be more than happy to sign up to a transition period that lasts 10 years. And if we conclude a deal before then we can close it early. That's fine. The timetable is determined by Boris Johnson. So there's none of this EU running down the clock. That's a nonsense straight away. And it says to push Britain to attach strings to any deal. What you're basically saying there is the EU would like to negotiate a deal that's good for the EU. Yeah, that's how negotiations work, and that's what we're going to find out. And that is what this David Frost is going to come to a rude awakening to, because although Brussels are very happy with him, and although he will be much better than a minister at making decisions in this and more experienced, he is not actually experienced in trade negotiations. That is very important to make clear. There are certain realities he is going to discover. He is not going to succeed in doing what he wants to succeed. It says they include access to UK fisheries. That is definitely, any deal is definitely going to have that. That's all there is to it. That's all there is to it. And also, and I'll keep re-emphasising this, the UK fishing industry have no problem with that. You know, somehow this narrative is allowed to creep into the national discussion that UK fishermen want to keep out other nationalities' fishermen from UK waters. That is not true. That is not in any level true. British fishermen in British waters already catch more fish than is sold in the UK. So they can't sell them in the UK, they have to sell them abroad. And British fishermen also fish in other people's waters as well. So if we were to say only British fishermen can fish in UK waters, it means two things. First of all, you're stopping a load of British fishermen from being able to ply their trade because they're used to fishing in other waters. And the second thing is that, so they lose all their jobs. They can try and muscle in on the British territory if they like, but again, if they just lost all their jobs, then the British fishermen that are used to fishing British waters would again land more fish than they can sell, because they can't sell them in the EU because the tariffs would be, well, there'd be two things. First of all, the tariffs would be excessive, prohibitively expensive, quite frankly. And second of all, there'd be protests. You know, the French are pretty good at protesting. Spain would also protest as well because they have fish. Any coastal country would naturally not want to allow British fish onto their markets. They would stop them. And that's how you get them into the EU in the first place. So, yeah. So the access to the UK fisheries is going to happen. It's going to happen because it has to happen. No one's actually objecting to it other than people who don't understand the UK fishing industry. And they say here about Mr. Frost will push back hard. I've no doubt. But what with? What has he got to push back hard with? And like I say, the overall theme of this is who is in charge of Brexit? It's not David Frost. Because David Frost is not a minister. He doesn't have the authority. A minister has to tell him what our objectives are. Ministers have to decide policy. Civil servants then carry it out. This is why the civil service in Northern Ireland has been in such trouble over the past few years when Stormont was closed down, because the civil servants were still there, but there was no political direction for them. So all they could do was carry on previous orders, so to speak. So we still need a minister in charge, because otherwise all David Frost can go with is the guidelines that are set to him. In a changing situation where he needs a change in policy, who's going to do that? Who's going to have ministerial oversight over the process? That's the question, and it's a question that has not been answered. Anyway, next one. So this is regarding Germany's side of things in the Brexit negotiations, what they particularly want. So this is from someone who is British but has lived in Germany for some years, and of course, very much integrated into the culture. So there's a couple of comments here, which are very interesting. I'd like to go through. It says, whilst the Brexiteers will go on about British sovereignty, Germans are fully aware of German history. And actually, I'll come to that point in a minute. It says, the German education system is different from the British education system in dealing with the country's history. Think back to your education in the UK. You will not find many examples of then the history of Britain was taught showing Britain in a bad light, just skipping over the slave industry, skipping over how many foreigners were killed, blah, blah, blah. This is sort of true in many ways. Partly, I would argue that, when you talk about, British Empire and slavery isn't really linked as such to the British Empire. And that's the reason, because British Empire obviously went absolutely insane on the slave trade. But then so did all the other European empires and the empires before. Bearing in mind, British were some of the original slaves. Not the original slaves, but we were Italian slaves a couple of thousand years ago. So, it all cycles round. And actually the British Empire was responsible for abolishing slavery. That's not to downplay the fact that it ever went along with it, because you could argue, had it been a good empire, if there's ever such thing as a good empire, which there fundamentally is not, then they could have said right from the start, well, we're going to be a moral empire. Even though an empire is basically formed by nicking other people's countries, which is not a very nice thing to do. But we're going to, other than that, be nice, and we're going to not have slaves at all. So obviously that didn't happen. But that's the issue there. But I'll tell you what is true, coming back to your first comment there. Whilst the Brexiteers will go on about British sovereignty, Germans are fully aware of German history. The same period of history, the British are not at all aware of. So the Germans are very aware of that, shall we say, early 20th, first half of the 20th century history. The British are not, but they think they are. And it all comes back to this Brexiteer banging on about, oh, you know, Geoffrey Boycott, for those who don't know, he knows his stuff about cricket. Absolutely. If you want to know about cricket, you do listen to him. He knows his stuff. On anything else, he's an ignoramus. On Brexit, he's an ignoramus. And he's one of these ones banging on about, we won 2 world wars. No, we didn't. We were on the winning side in 2 world wars, but we did not win them. America and Russia won them. Let's be clear about that. Let us be clear about that. And even if you go back to, we won the Battle of Britain, that was before America came in the Second World War. Yeah, we weren't on our own though, were we? And I find it insulting for people to say, we won on our own. We didn't. We had allies from everywhere, from in Europe, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, you know, and it's insulting to those countries to erase them out of history. So yeah, you're absolutely right. British history doesn't teach that, and it is absolutely appalling. The next one, it says here, Germans are extremely aware of the damage that their country has previously done. When the far-right political groups like the AfD have a political demonstration, the police have to protect the far-right group because they're usually outnumbered by at least 20 to 1. So although the AfD can get a couple hundred people demonstrating, the counter-protest will be in the thousands. I'm going to say the same thing is actually true in this country, because when you looked at all the pro-Brexit demonstrations, they were heavily outnumbered. Bearing in mind, of course, protest sizes don't necessarily reflect the general population. I would say, although Remain demonstrations massively, by many orders, massively outnumbered pro-Brexit protests, I'm not saying that the attitudes in the country are reflected by that. I just think that people on the Remain side, a much higher proportion of them feel strongly enough to actually go out and protest and put themselves out and go to a lot of expense and give up a lot of their time to do it. Whereas the pro-Brexit ones just wanted to go out their door and put a cross in a box. They couldn't be bothered to do anything more than that. Maybe a week or so ago, fire off a firework, that was about it. But I would like to think that in this country the same thing will apply in terms of protests. But, you know, interesting comments. It is very different culture. That's quite clear. Next one. Someone here. Which looks silly on first hand, but some people are taking this seriously. It says, I have an idea. To avoid economic isolation and catastrophe, how about the UK enter into a trade and political pact of the like-minded and nearby states to create a single market which allows goods, capital, services and people to move freely across the national borders of member states? And of course, obviously, this is a sarky response to Brexit in terms of, what do we do to make the best of a pro-Brexit Britain? I know, why don't we form a union? There's already one existing, the EU. Should we join it? But in actual fact, some people are actually suggesting that is what we do, without being facetious, without being sarky. And it sort of works like this. So for some years now, ever since the Brexit referendum at least, and arguably even before the Brexit referendum, the pro-EU side was very much focused on the damage caused by leaving the EU. I'm one of them, certainly. I didn't have the channel before the Brexit referendum. If I did, I would have been very much plugging the benefits of being the EU. I've much more since, and certainly since starting the channel, focused on the damage of leave. And the reason for that is because, well, we've left. And even after the referendum, when we hadn't left, the default position was we're leaving. In such a scenario, it is you're naturally inclined, whether right or wrong, and it may be wrong, you're naturally inclined to focus on the damage that this is going to do. The so-called Project Fear, which in actual fact now is Project Reality. And the argument here is, in actual fact, should we stop going on about the bad things that will happen as a result of Brexit? Because people will see those for themselves next year. Whether they will link them with Brexit, which you should think would be obvious, but is another matter. But they're going to happen, and we have well, we've lost our membership. We haven't actually left the EU yet, but that is inevitable now. That is now realistically definitely going to happen. Yes, the transition period could keep getting extended and could keep getting extended to a point at which we go, do you know what, should we just rejoin? In which case, technically, you might argue we've never actually left, although we've just lost our influence. But realistically, I believe we are actually going to fully leave, which means leaving the customs union and leaving the single market. And that is, a fait accompli now. So the argument maybe should turn towards, right, okay, you want us to make the best of it and look forwards and not backwards. Great. Okay, what we need is to be able to be part of a strong trading bloc like the rest of the world is, like every single country on earth is. Like the United Kingdom is about to become the only country that's not part of a trading association of other nation states. So how about we start off by doing that? Obviously, any country in the world, every single country, does most of its trade with its nearest neighbours. So what we should do is we should form this union with our nearest neighbours. And what we should also do is to form it with countries who share our values, So let's find ones who share our fundamental Western democratic values. Yeah, we'll do that. We need to, it needs to be strong. We need to get lots of nations involved. Okay, yeah. So what we should do is persuade the European Union of Nations to join with us. Oh, there's a process for already doing that, so we can apply to join the EU, and that does the same thing. And we're quite a large country while we remain at the moment, although England, even on its own, I suppose, would still be a fairly large country in Europe. And, we get quite a lot of seats in the European Parliament, so we get quite a lot of say then. Oh, that's fantastic. That's brilliant. Yeah, that would be good. So making the argument for joining the EU as opposed to rejoining it is some people's take on it now, which I think is quite interesting. Next one. So this is about the Nissan so-called plan that's been reported, which is, actually we can make the best out of Brexit by massively increasing our market share, and we'll stay in the UK and we'll pick up where other people will have lost by leaving the country. And Brexiteers saying, look, there's a company here who thinks Brexit's a great idea. There's a Brexit dividend. Whereas I was arguing, no, it's not. Because the reason they'd be doing it is because they wouldn't otherwise be able to trade with the UK. And it's, as this person notes, I'll read this comment before I follow that thought. It says, the Nissan analysis also said that they would need to get a 20% market share, which I did mention in the video, in the UK to make it feasible. It is absolutely normal for companies to go through what-if scenarios. This is not a plan. It's not even a suggestion. It will be one of tens, if not hundreds of plans they do every year. And yes, I agree with that. And that's where you can get distorted views of things. And this is why it is important that the media present balanced views in a way that they simply do not. And this was reported in the Financial Times, I think, wasn't it? Which is not even a bad one, really, but it's still not very objective. And it is right. They report that, there's this plan. Nissan are denying it. But they're reporting, this plan exists. This is what they're intending to do. But that's not true. It's like this person is saying here, this is a plan that has been considered and maybe is still under active consideration. But as the person says here, that could be a dozen such plans, all wildly different. And this may be the only plan that involves Nissan being in this country, operating still in Sunderland beyond a couple of years' time. And that's what they should have made clear, and it's what they've not made clear. So the way people will read it now is, this plan's been reported. Nissan are denying it, but yeah, they're going to do that because it's not official policy yet. But they've got this plan. Why would they develop this plan if they weren't going to do it, if they weren't taking it seriously? Forgetting, of course, that there could be other mutually exclusive plans being just as seriously, if not more so, considered as well. And yeah, that point is really important, is the plan does basically assume that they can gain 20% market share. That means that 1 in 5 cars sold in the UK will be a Nissan. It assumes that. And it's light on the details of how that would happen. I imagine it would follow that because lots of other car manufacturers will leave the country, and if Boris Johnson follows on his threats to have massive import tariffs on any cars coming into the country, then it'll be a lot cheaper to sell cars in this country if they're made in this country. But for most companies, it won't be worth it for the market share they have. So if they left, then they could potentially expand into that void. but it is based on that. And if they can't, like let's say lots of other car manufacturers try and do the same thing, they'll crowd each other out, and it won't be lucrative enough to do that. So some will leave, some will inevitably leave. Next one. I like this one. It says, oh, come on, and the EU acts like Mother Teresa. So a bit of context here. This is just someone explaining the behaviour of British politicians, which, let's be honest, is not very good. The EU as well has politicians in it, and politicians are politicians. You know, politicians in the EU also act with a certain amount of self-interest as well, and this is perfectly true. However, where the difference is, and this is why politicians in the EU as a collective, not necessarily individually, but as a collective, are more mature, more responsible, is as follows. Because in Britain, politicians in Parliament in Westminster act out of self-interest, and they get to do that because, particularly at the moment, let's say Boris Johnson, for example, Prime Minister with a large majority, he can act purely out of self-interest now. Self-interest, because he's got that power. Even before he had quite as much power, he could still act out of the self-interest of his party. So it's still quite a narrow bit of interest, which is not in tune with the country's interests. In the EU, that doesn't really work, because if a politician acts out of self-interest, there are lots more to say, well, actually, that's not in my interest, so I'm going to stop you. And no politician in the EU has the sort of control over the EU Parliament or Commission or Council that Boris Johnson has over Westminster. Because it's simply not possible. It doesn't work like that. And the other thing is, even if politicians were going to act in the interest of their country, where they'll have a lot more backing, there are other countries that it's not in their interest to do, so they would oppose it. So you naturally have this situation where if everyone in the EU tried to act out of self-interest, nothing would get done because everyone else would oppose it. You'd just have yourself. It's like, you know, the scene in the third Pirates of the Caribbean where all the pirate kings are nominating themselves to be like Chief Pirate King or whatever. I can't remember the details. And they're all going around knowing full well that this is rubbish because everyone's going to nominate themselves. But then, of course, Jack Sparrow nominates someone else. But that's the sort of thing. You know, if everyone just acts in their own national self-interest or national interest, then no one else is going to back them because there's no give and take. So it naturally sets itself up for compromise politics, something we're not terribly familiar with in this country, in the UK. Other countries are a little bit more because they're more used to coalitions, and not all coalitions work out well, but where they do, then naturally it means you go into politics knowing you need to compromise with others who have very different views to yourself. We're very bad at that in this country, and that is a problem there. So yeah, in terms of the thing, the EU act like Mother Teresa. Yeah, they're gonna, politicians are politicians, but they don't get away with acting out of pure self-interest unless it's in the interest of the whole EU. But they don't get to act out of national interest or party interest or pure individual self-interest because they don't have the power. No one has the power to do that. Next one. I'll put a comment here and then a little response to it. I've edited out the names to protect the innocent. So the quote here, I love this quote as well. I've forgotten who said it. But anyway, it says, democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. It sounds like a Mark Twain thing, but I can't remember who actually said this. Britain decides to put that to the test. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that has rung loud and clear throughout this whole Brexit process. People will argue with you very firmly when you ask them a simple question. You even get responses. You will even get people, I kid you not, when you argue with them saying, oh, that's not fair. You've obviously done a lot of research into that. Yes, I have. Why haven't you? Why are you so sure of your opinion if you don't know the details? What's that about? But anyway, the response is really what I'm talking here. Technocracy means that consensus opinion is bypassed by unelected elites. Consensus opinion is the closest humans can get to objectivity according to a colossal body of psychological research. Perfectly true. Undeniably true. But here's where your problem comes. Technocracy or democracy. So let's start from the point of view of democracy. And you look at, this is why Winston Churchill used to say this is the worst form of government apart from all the others we've tried. So you look at democracy and you look at the downsides of democracy. What's the downsides of democracy? Policies are decided by people who know nothing about the policies and laws they're enacting. So, of course, they have advisors, but they have advisors that they trust, that they like. They'll choose their advisors irrationally because they're no good at choosing those advisors, ultimately, because they don't understand the things that these advisors are experts in. They might accept that this expert's an expert. So one expert tells you one thing, one expert tells you another. You don't know who is actually the more expert, and you don't know who's right. They're telling you different things. So what do? You do what an ordinary person does. You go with the one who says the thing you like. Oh yeah, that's the world I'd like to live in. I'll go with that, whether it's realistic or not, because you're not a good judge of it. And also because politicians, if we're honest, yeah, there are hard-working politicians, and you know, there's a lot of privations in being an MP, and absolutely true, and we mustn't like discount those. But you can also be a lazy MP, in which case you get quite a lot of money. You get to be all important, you know, going around local events, and you know, you get a nice pension at the end of it, and subsidised bar in West Palace of Westminster. It's all lovely. If you're willing to live that sort of life, I wouldn't like it so much, all that having to travel and get up a second home in London, all the rest of it. I'm not a homebody. But if you're all right with that sort of life, and you like people telling you how great you are and giving you drinks, it's a good life. It's a really good life, and you can be quite lazy, and it's still really good life. And what you're fully focused on is not doing the best for your constituents, although you'll need to be seen to be doing that. It's making sure you get elected next time round, which means you have very short-term thinking, extremely short-term thinking, and that is the downside of democracy. So it means the sorts of things that will be good for the country, if it takes 10, 15, 20, 25 years' time for them to come to fruition and for us to get the benefits of them. Which, for example, if you were to really sort education out in this country, it'll take a full generation. Because you have to start from the ground up with it. It's dreadful. Well, I say dreadful. There are worse, of course, but it's nowhere near as good as it should be. But the whole thing needs a rethink. And it would take you a generation to get the benefits of that before they enter the workplace. And we've got the skills necessary to drive like modern Britain. 25 years' time. No one's going to do that because you don't get the benefits while you're still in power. That doesn't help you win a seat in a few years' time. So you don't support that. You support something that's going to give you short-term gain, but not long-term gain. And so there's all these downsides to democracy. So then you think, so what we need is just experts running things. We want our health department run by health experts. You know, we want people to analyse data who are actual analysts and understand the data they're looking at and understand the correlations and can draw valid conclusions. You know, we want economists in charge of the economy. You know, all of these things. You want experts in charge of the various fields of our life, because then they will make the best decisions. They'll still be deciding amongst themselves. You know, like a guild, a council, or so on, but they will know what they're doing. So that's what we should have. But then, of course, you say but then you're not talking about democracy because you can't democratically elect these people because they have to be experts and only other experts can recognise them as experts, not ordinary people. And then you might get corruption because you have people who know they're going to be in this position and they're securing that position because they are the expert. So selfishness comes into it, maybe even, you know, egos come into it as well, and they don't necessarily make the best decisions and all the rest of it. What we really need is for people to be able to decide, and if a politician is not doing a good enough job, we need to be able to get rid of them. So what we need is democracy. Oh no, then corruption comes into it because politicians will form political parties who will be used to present their candidate in the best possible light. In return, that candidate does what that party wants, that party leader wants. Oh, and the corruption, you know, and government contracts go out to political donors and all the rest of it. And it's a hideous cycle. It's a hideous cycle. The bottom line is that there is no good system of government. There cannot be. The ideal system of government is benevolent, wise dictatorship. but dictatorships in history occasionally have been benevolent and wise, not very often. That's usually been a blip in human history. And so we're just stuck. And the problem is, of course, we can't cope when we don't know people. We can cope in small communities where we know everyone. So local groups can cope very well. Small societies can cope very well. They'll elect the right people onto the boards, the committees, the executives, because everyone knows everyone else. Not as easy to pull the wool over your eyes. But then, you know, when you're trying to judge who's going to be good for you out of someone you don't even meet, you don't know them, you don't get to ask them questions really, or if you do, they don't answer them because, again, the party machine. You're knackered. Human evolution didn't cope for that. Final one. So this is about Johnson applying various bluffs which he thinks are negotiating strategies. Person says here, I guess Johnson still hasn't learned that you can't bluff when everyone knows your cards. No, this is ultimately the problem, isn't it? The only way he can bluff, and there are bluffs he does genuinely have, and that's by acting like a mad dog, which is why he's done it a few times. Some German politicians visited the country last week. It was embarrassing. They went away thinking, he's a nutter. He's absolutely insane. That is his only actual bluff. The fact that people will still, even people in the know, people who are not stupid, who are politically aware, will still not accept that Boris Johnson will do the most insane things. There are people who are still convinced that there's no way Boris Johnson will take us out of the transition period without a deal with the EU. I'm not going to say he's 100% certain to do that. What I am saying is I think he's very likely to do that. I think the only reason people won't believe he'll do that is because they're just convinced it's lunacy and they don't accept that he's a lunatic. I think he's a lunatic. I think he can bluff his way out of any situation. That's why. I mean, look at the facts. He's already getting his excuses in. He's getting his ministers to get excuses in. Everyone at the moment is saying, oh, if Brexit goes badly, it's this person's fault or that person's fault. None of them are going to say... In 2015-16, they were telling us how great Brexit was going to be. Why aren't they doing that now? Oh, yeah, they're saying, oh, yeah, Brexit's going to be great. Tell us the details. Tell us how Brexit's going to be great for us. Tell us the things that you were telling us a few years ago. They've completely dried up. They've gone. They're no longer telling us what we're going to benefit from Brexit. They're no longer even bothering. They're just saying, oh, but yeah, of course it's going to be great, but on the off chance it's not, it's their fault. And everyone's saying it, and if everyone's saying it, then that's because they're gearing up for that outcome, I'm afraid. And indeed, yeah, everyone knows our cards, the ones we have, and you can't bluff when your cards are face up on the table. Exactly. So anyway, that's the Political Postbox for this week. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.